Hello and welcome to this new blog post on sustainability, weather data and Dynamics 365 finance. In today's post, I would like to start with the question, what companies need actually weather data and what does finance have to do with that? And here I started with kind of list of sectors or corporations that need weather data. What you might imagine are airline companies, freight forwarding companies that might need wind conditions, wave conditions, and so on to optimize their routes to save fuel and costs, but also to reduce the environmental damage from the emissions they are doing. Then we have energy supply companies. They need information about droughts, heat waves, because if they have this information, then they can expect how will the energy demand develop? Will we see some blackouts and do I need some rescue teams if I expect them? And what about droughts where I do not have sufficient cooling water, for example, for my nuclear power plants, and where I need to do emergency shutdowns? All of these are questions for these companies. And then we have event-based companies. So if you are a sports event company, then you might need information about thunderstorms, freak weather conditions, and so on to protect your customers. And this might result in additional costs for providing shelter, emergency services, and so on. And then, of course, we have insurance companies, agricultural companies, and investment companies. They all need information about major storms, fire, droughts, and so on to calculate the expected costs for removing the damages, to calculate insurance costs, and probably to redo or calculate product prices if you are issuing weather derivatives. Okay, and in the following I will focus mainly on agriculture, forestry companies that have the problem of extreme weather conditions, droughts or floods that might destroy their harvest. But what I will show you in the following can be applied to all of the other companies that I mentioned here. And what I'm doing here is I focus on the area where I come from, because here we face problems with the heat and with the water. So this area where I live is a winery area, and in the summer there is not sufficient water. So what farmers are doing is they include here special pipes to water the vineyards. Or the other picture, this one is in the spring when we suddenly have very cold temperatures, and the farmers need to make sure that their plants don't get destroyed by these strange weather conditions. So all of this results in additional costs. And in the longer term, these farmers, they have to think whether they can still continue with their business model or whether they have to change it and maybe use different products or different plants to grow. So what they need is basically in the short term a kind of forecast to prevent or reduce the damages, and in the long term they need to see whether the current cultivation, so the business model, still makes sense or not. And what we will focus on is more the short-term effect, with a special focus on finance and accounting, of course. Okay, and what I will do in the following is I will try to collect weather data, and I will show you how I'm doing that. Then I calculate some risk indicators, and then I'm setting up a model to calculate a kind of risk index that I'm using then to record a provision inside of Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. But there are some problems. The first problem is the weather data. I tried a couple of well-known weather data provider like NASA, ESA, USGS, and so on. And all of them provide weather data, but sometimes the file format is not usable or not directly usable in a way that you trigger these or analyze the data on a daily basis without any intervention. Sometimes the files are zipped, Sometimes they are in a strange format that needs special software. Sometimes the data is not complete. Some data series suddenly end in 2019. Sometimes the API is not public or not free of charge. And sometimes the precision of the data, especially when you talk about satellite data, is not good enough to focus on my area Würzburg here. So what did I do? I had a look at DWD. This one is the Deutsche Wetterdienst. And they basically have a network of different stations for which they collect weather data on a daily, hourly, monthly and annual basis. And here you see the different weather stations. The one that I'm here is probably somewhere around here. There's no city here, but that's where I'm coming from. And they provide you this data. They collect it with different tools, devices. Sometimes they have weather stations, sometimes they use satellite data, sometimes they use airplanes, and other tools. And these are kind of, I call it IoT or sensors, that make this data available for me. Okay, so next thing is I had to think about indicators. So what are some risk indicators that give me an idea whether I will have a good or bad harvest? And the first one is the forest fire hazard. It's an index that runs from 1 to 5. 5 is very high hazard, 1 is very low. And this is the kind of forward-looking indicator for which I took the average. It's calculated for 5 days, today plus 4 days in the future, and I just calculated the average. Then I have 3 indicators: sunshine duration, precipitation, and soil temperature. And I calculated this indicator for the last month and then compared it with the last 5 years of the same months. So as an example, I took the sunshine duration May 2022 and compared it with the sunshine duration May 2021, May 2020, May 2019, and so on, to build the 5-year average here. Of course, you could have built a 30-year average or whatever, because the data quality of Deutsche Wetterdienst is really good. But I said, okay, for my example, that's sufficient. And the last indicator that I used is the wind force, because I said, okay, if there's a strong wind, my trees or what I grow might be destroyed. And here there's something special, because sunshine, precipitation, and soil temperature, they closely relate to each other. I introduced a weighting indicator, because if the sun is shining, the precipitation is low, and the soil temperature is probably high. So I said these 3 indicators are actually 1. And the next site here gives you the link where I get the data. So these are all publicly available sites where you can select the indicator. The indicator is here in green color. So that's the one for sunshine duration. 5705 is my station. This is Würzburg. And then you have strings for before and after. So you can really define for which period you want to analyze the data. And these are just examples so that you get an idea where you get this data from. And then I said, okay, in my area, if there is a high forest fire hazard or a risk, then I say the potential for damages is high. So that's bad for me. If there's too much sunshine, then this is also bad for me, because my crops are destroyed, and in this area where I'm living, there is not much water anyway. On the other hand, if there's some rain, that's good for me, because in Würzburg there is not sufficient rain. This might be totally different in your area where you live, because if there is already a lot of rain and it rains more, then this might also destroy something. But for my specific example, some rain is better than no rain. And the soil temperature, of course, if it's higher, then it's worse for me, because things don't grow that well, and the same here for the wind. And the model that I use is like this. So I said, okay, forest fire index, and then this weighted sunshine, precipitation, and soil temperature index. and then the wind force scaled by 3 gives me an indicator that gives me an idea about the risk. And then I said, okay, if this indicator is smaller than 1, then the risk is low. So I do not need to make a posting in Dynamics to record a reserve. If the indicator is between 1 and 3, the medium is, let's say medium, I build a 2% provision. And if the indicator is higher than 3, I build a 5% provision of maybe last year's revenue or something else. And this is something you need to define for your specific company. But after all of this introduction talk, let's now have a look at the demo and my application so that you get an idea how this all works together and how we make the link to Dynamics 365 Finance. Okay, we are here now in Power Automate. And why is that? Well, because we want to grab the data from Deutsche Wetterdienst, from their websites basically, on a regular basis. And that's why I have here a recurrence trigger that runs, I think, every month. And that grabs me the data. For testing purposes, I changed it a bit to hourly, but usually you will have this on a monthly basis. Then I have a couple of variables that I need to calculate the averages. We will come back to that later. So I have here the initialization of a couple of variables, and then I have here 5 different scopes where I calculate the wind force index, precipitation index, and so on. So if we go, for example, for the precipitation index, or let's say wind force index, because I prepared that already. Then I have here the start date of the current month. So in my example, it would be the 1st of May. And this second one, the second compose element, gives you the last day of the month before the previous month. So this would be 31st of March. And with these dates, I can then grab the data for the wind force indicator. This is this parameter setting here. For Würzburg, which is this station number. And then I have here the before and after values. And this string gives me then the values for April. And then I'm doing a conversion, and I convert it basically into a floating variable. That is necessary because the data that you receive, they show up in such a format. And I prepared that here. So this is the way how the data arrives. You see there is a value, 2.63 here. This is the unit, and this string needs to be converted into a number. So I'm basically just needing this 2.63, and that's what this conversion is doing here. And then things repeat. So I'm grabbing here the data for the previous months of the previous year. So this would be April 2021. And then we have here 2020, 2019, and so on. And I always hold the data, and then I convert them and calculate averages. So that's the average. And then I calculate here my indicator. And that's the principle that I use basically for all of these indicators. There's a small difference when it comes to soil temperatures, because Deutsche Wetterdienst provides this data on an hourly basis. So what I did is I basically have here an apply to each function where I calculate the daily average, and then at the end I calculate the monthly average. It's just a kind of workaround that I have. And then for the forest fire index, I use a slightly different approach, because the way how this is done is like this. They have a website that they update on a daily basis, and if you look at that, you can see the fire index for the next couple of days, and then you need to filter for your area. So in my case it's Würzburg, and then you build the average of this data. And Flow can help with all of that to give you the data. Once I have these indicators, I add them into Excel table. I could have used Dataverse or something else. I just used Excel for demonstration purposes. And the way how it looks is like this. You have a timestamp, and then you have the forest fire index, sunshine index, precipitation, wind force, soil temperature, and at the end you have the weather damage index. And of course these values, apart from the forest fire index, they don't change. So these values don't change because I basically take monthly data. I don't take daily data, just monthly. And therefore, whenever I run this flow in May, it will always have the same data here. This one, the forest fire index, will change if I run it for testing purposes. But usually you will do this, or I will do this in my example on a monthly basis to get this indicator. Okay, and then we said, okay, based on this indicator, we record a provision in Dynamics. And what I could have done is, I could have gone here and said, okay, based on the weather damage index, I collect the ledger postings of my revenues or total asset value that I want to multiply with my percentage that I have shown you in the PowerPoint. But that's a bit difficult because if you have millions of data and if you want to use Power Automate to calculate a total value, then this is probably not the best approach. So what I did was the following. I said, okay, I have here the weather damage index and I have here a couple of conditions. So I say if it's less than 1, then we end up here. In our case, it's less than 3. So we end up in a medium risk. And what I did is I updated an allocation rule that I called weather provision. And I said, okay, if the weather risk index is bit less than 3, but more than 1, I update the amount to 0.02. So why do I need to do that? Well, this allows me to calculate the provision that I need to post. Let me show you that in Dynamics. So I have here my ledger allocation rule, weather provision. I have here the source. The source are basically all revenue accounts that start with 401. The destination is here the reserve account, so it's a balance sheet account for the weather risks. And note that we have here a allocation of 100%. So if I do not make any other setup, this would result in a situation that 100% of our revenue would be posted on that. And that's of course not what I want. But what I want is I want to have only 2% of this, and therefore I have this multiplier here, which is updated by flow. And then the other thing, the expense account is coming from here. And then the important thing for your application, if you want to do something similar, is this date interval. What you see here is the current year to date value. Why is that? Well, because I did not have data for 2021 in my machine here. So I used just the current year. And I also said, okay, I want to run this on a monthly basis. But if I run this calculation on a monthly basis and I want to post 2% of my revenue on a monthly basis, then I would have by a far too high amount. I would rather have to divide this percentage figure by 12. Otherwise I have really a more than double counting. The amount that would be recorded as provision would be 12 times higher than I would like to have. So if you want to use something similar, you have to be careful how often you want to do this provision and how you set up this date interval and these multipliers. The outcome of this, if you process this allocation rule, is then a journal that posts here on an expense account, and then here is the reserve account. And of course you can do this on a monthly basis, on a quarterly, on an annual basis, whatever you like, and all by means of standard functionalities in Dynamics. Okay, and this kind of trick, making use of ledger allocation rules instead of calculating the provisions here inside of Flow, is just a shortcut to put some of the calculation load away from Power Automate to Dynamics, where we have special functionalities for that. Okay, so that's it what I want to show you. So let's go back to my PowerPoint for some closing remarks. So after this short system demo, let's have a look at a quick summary. So what I did or demonstrated here was a simple example how weather data can be used to assess weather or climate related risks and incorporating them into Dynamics 365. Yeah. There are of course thousands of things that you can improve. Yeah, so you can use different or additional weather risk indicators. You can use weather forecast data to predict the months, the quarter, days if you need. Yeah. You can use hourly data, and if you have sufficient budget, you can use some of the other providers that offer these services for a subscription fee. Yeah. And of course also, if you do not have a station network as in Germany from Deutsche Wetterdienst, you might grab data from satellites, especially the ESA Sentinels. These are a couple of satellites that grab similar data. They also provide this information, but you need special software and conversions to bring the data into Power Automate. Okay, but if we summarize the whole thing, what we investigated here is the relationship between the environmental perspective, that one here, and the economic perspective of the sustainability triangle. Yeah? So I hope this kind of post gave you an idea about the linkage between these different spheres and how you can bring them together in Dynamics 365, finance and operations with the help of the Power Platform. So that's it. So thanks very much for listening and watching, and looking forward to seeing you in the next blog post then.